In this video, we'll take a look at the new Inspired by Nature pack for Ableton Live 11. Inspired by Nature is a set of 6 Max for Live devices that use natural phenomena from physics and biology to generate notes, sounds, and effects. If you're into creating sound that is complex and organic, these are the tools you want to use. Each device is really creative, but also quite complex, so we'll look at how they work, as well as some of the kinds of sounds you can create. We won't explore every detail of each device, we'll just focus on the most important controls to get started. By the end of this video, you'll understand what each device does, how you can use it, and the kinds of sounds you can make. Before we dive in, remember that these are Max for Live devices, so you'll need Ableton Live Suite or Live Standard with Max for Live installed to use them. If you're relatively new to Ableton or Max, then I'd recommend first watching my video that explores Max for Live in more detail. There's a link in the description. Okay, let's dive in. We'll start with one of the simpler devices, Bouncy Notes. Bouncy Notes is a MIDI device that generates notes based on a simulation of bouncing balls. Play a note, and a ball will be created in the central display. The ball bounces on the piano roll at the bottom of the display and outputs a note with every bounce. When the ball no longer bounces high enough, it's automatically destroyed. The first set of controls we'll look at control the gravity simulation. Higher gravity and mass means the ball will fall faster and bounce lower. Lower gravity and mass means the ball will fall slower and bounce higher. Friction reduces the effect of gravity over time. If friction is high, the ball will bounce back less each time, as it's slowed by friction. The gravity and mass of each ball can also be affected by the MIDI velocity of the incoming note. The next section we'll look at concerns the creation and destruction of new balls. As we've seen already, balls can be created when a note is played, but balls can also be created automatically. When auto is enabled and Live's transport is running, balls will be created at regular intervals, set by the interval control. Lifetime controls how long each ball exists after it's created. If lifetime is too short, balls will be destroyed before they can even reach the piano roll. But if we increase the lifetime, balls will stick around for longer, and more balls will exist simultaneously. We can also limit the total number of balls that can exist at once using the voices control. Let's start to look at some of the ways bouncing balls can be used. First, let's see how to use it as a sort of generative sequencer. Currently, the piano roll contains the full range of available notes, but we can click the piano icon to open up the scale settings. Let's set this to D minor pentatonic. We'll also set the starting note to D2, and the range to 15. So notes are now only being generated in the key of D minor pentatonic and only in a range of 15 notes above D2. Currently, notes are being generated with no specific musical timing. This might be exactly what you want and can sound really good if you're trying to make something more organic and soundscape-ish. If we want something a little more musical, we can use the quantize control to lock the output to specific rhythmic intervals. Perhaps we want to skew the sequencer to generate lower notes more often than high ones. We can use the slider at the top of the display to apply a directional force to each new ball. We can, for example, skew the balls towards the lower notes. you'll notice that the balls bounce off the sides of the display as well. If we apply the right amount of directional force, we can make it so that some balls rebound off the sidewall and bounce back up the piano roll, generating higher notes. Perhaps we want something less generative with a bit more regularity. Let's reset the directional force, disable auto mode, and trigger this clip that contains a MIDI chord pattern. Now a more regular pattern of balls and corresponding notes is being generated. Let's reintroduce some generative qualities to this pattern. Remember, we can set the mass and gravity of each ball to respond to the incoming MIDI velocity. Let's go over to our MIDI notes and use Live 11's new velocity range feature to apply a random velocity value to the MIDI notes each time they play. Going back to Bouncy notes, we can see that each new ball generates with a slightly different mass and gravity, causing them to fall and bounce at different rates. This creates slight offsets in the timing of our output notes. We could even use the random direction control to apply a random directional force to each ball, which adds new notes to our pattern. As you can see, Bouncy Notes is really good at creating or modifying MIDI patterns and introducing some organic variation. You can be really subtle with it, or go quite extreme if you like. Try using it to create organic soundscapes and textures. Use it in drum rack mode to add generative fills to a programmed drum beat. The next device, Emit, is a granular sample playback device, meaning it works like a regular sample or looper, but instead of simply playing back the sample as is, the playback is divided into small chunks called grains. We can control the playback of these grains to achieve some interesting results. We start by dragging and dropping a sample into the interface to load it. Here's our sample. Emit can either generate sound automatically whenever Live's transport is running, or it can be triggered by MIDI notes. For now, we'll leave it in automatic mode while we learn some of the other controls. The display shows a spectrogram of the loaded sample. This represents time on the horizontal axis and frequency on the vertical axis, from low to high. In the center of the display, we see what is known as an emitter. The emitter generates particles that play back the sample. Each particle will play back a small segment, or grain, of whatever time and frequency range it's currently passing over. We can click and drag to move the emitter around the sample. We can drag on the corners of the emitter to change its size. Particles will generate at a random location within the bounds of the emitter, so changing the emitter's size will affect where in the sample a particle might be created. We can also move and adjust the bounds of the emitter using these controls. Here we can change the angle at which particles are emitted, allowing us to also move backwards through the sample. We can set whether particles are emitted in one or both directions. And we can set the width, or the range of angles in which particles can be emitted. How particles are created and how they move is controlled in this section of the device. Similar to what we saw in Bouncy notes, rate and lifetime control how frequently particles are generated and how long they last for. Grains controls the number of particles that can exist simultaneously. If the grains, rate, and lifetime controls are high enough, you can have multiple particles running simultaneously. Let's head over to the Grain tab, where we can adjust some playback controls for the grains created by the particles. Here we can apply a simple pitch shift. Or apply a rudimentary spectral blurring effect. By default, the vertical position of each particle controls a bandpass filter for that grain, only playing back a narrow band of frequencies around the particle's position. Here we can adjust the width and Q of that filter. We can also toggle the Y-axis switch so that the vertical position of each particle affects the stereo position of that particle instead. There's also a second emitter that can be enabled. This behaves exactly like the first emitter, so we'll skip it for now and head over to the Mod tab. Here we can apply modulation to controls within the device using the two built-in LFOs or envelopes. Switch to the Routing tab to set the destination of these modulators. For example, we could apply LFO 1 to modulate the X position of the emitter. We can also use Emit in MIDI mode. I'll switch back to Emitter 1's Emit tab to enable this. And play a simple MIDI pattern. By default, the pitch of each grain will be repitched according to the MIDI notes. But this can also be disabled, so only the rhythm of the notes is followed. Because Emit works with samples, the range of possible sounds is determined by the source sample you use. Let's try some other sounds. Emit excels at creating sounds that are organic and textural, or transforming samples into something completely unique and different. The range of possible sounds is fairly limitless, so be sure to spend a good deal of time exploring with this one. Next up is the rather weird and wonderful tree tone. Tree tone generates tones based on a tree growth simulation algorithm, aptly named space colonization. The results of the simulation are displayed in the center of the device. You can generate a new tree by clicking in the display, selecting one of the preset tree types, or generating a new random structure. Each new tree that is generated is completely unique, producing a different set of resonances. Each branch of a tree corresponds to a unique resonator. The thickness and length of the branches controls the pitch and volume of that resonator. Thicker, longer branches are louder and lower in pitch, while thinner, shorter branches are the opposite. The horizontal position of each branch sets that resonator's position in the stereo field. The tunings of the resonators can be set to a fixed scale using the scale toggle. Tuning and spread affect the tuning of the resonators, but not quite like a typical pitch control. Tuning offsets the overall tuning of the resonators to make them lower or higher. Spread increases the distance between relative tunings. This causes the lower pitches to get lower and the higher pitches to get higher. Over on the left are Treetone's two exciters. Exciters are the things that make our resonators actually resonate. Think of these like striking a bell or blowing on a flute to make sound. The first exciter is noise. Think of this as if you were constantly blowing onto a resonator. You can adjust the level of the noise, which affects how much the resonators are excited. We can also adjust the tonal balance of the noise using the filter cutoff and bandwidth controls. Wind applies a random modulation to the tone and volume of the noise, and the speed of the wind is adjustable. We can also excite the resonators using rain. This is somewhat like raindrops falling onto a xylophone. Speed controls the overall speed of the rain. The center and spread controls can be used to determine the center and the range of the frequencies at which the resonators will resonate. We can, of course, use both exciters simultaneously. Treetone also has two additional sections which can be hidden and shown as needed. The first allows you to route an external audio signal into Treetone to trigger the resonators. We'll skip this for now. The second tab lets us apply modulation to Treetone using the two built-in LFOs or envelopes. These can be useful for creating patterns that change over time, for example by modulating the tuning with a random LFO. As I'm sure you can hear, Treetone is excellent for generating evolving sound beds. It does have a very distinct character though, so it can be useful to run it through some effects to create a wider variety of sounds, while still benefiting from the organic quality it creates. The last three devices we'll look at, vector delay, vector gain, and vector FM, are all somewhat related. You'll notice that they share this common two-dimensional display. We'll set up particle systems within these displays that allow us to control parameters within the devices using magnetism and gravity. Let's see how that works. We'll start with vector gain. Vector gain is a granular sample playback device, similar to Emit. Load a sample into the device and it will start looping through the sample. In the center are 4 tabs we can use to access different pages of settings. Under the second tab, we can adjust some parameters that control the playback of the grains. These are similar to what we've already covered in Emit, so we'll skip them for now and instead look at the 5 controls at the bottom. These controls let us modulate parameters within the device using properties of the particles within the 2D simulation. For example, we could use the vertical position of the particles to control the filter cutoff. Let's head over to the third tab where we can adjust the properties of the particle simulation. Let's focus on the attractor section. At the center of the particle simulation, we now see a white square. This represents the attractor. Particles in the system are drawn towards or repelled from the attractor based on the strength control. If I increase strength, particles will be more strongly drawn to the attractor. If I set strength to a negative value, particles will be repelled. Let's increase the number of grains, or particles, to 2. Each particle represents a different slice of the sample, each with its own properties that are affected by their position within the simulation. Let's head back to the playback settings and apply the particle's horizontal position to panning. Let's take a look at the rest of these 5 controls. The third control uses a particle's distance from the center to affect elements of the sound. Let's use this to modify pitch. You'll now hear that as a particle moves further away from the center, its pitch increases. Within the grain settings, we can click the button labeled S to quantize the pitch modulation to a particular scale. Let's go with an octave. The fourth control uses a particle's velocity, the speed at which it is moving, to affect elements of the sound. Let's use this to affect the size of the grains. The fifth control uses the size of each particle to affect elements of the sound. Let's set this to affect the gain or volume of each grain. You'll notice that the size of each particle is currently constant, so this isn't doing much at the moment. Let's change this by heading over to the last tab where we can control the creation of new particles. By default, clicking in the particle display will create new random particles. If we increase the random mass control, the size of new particles will be randomized. The size of particles will affect whatever we've mapped it to, in this case the volume of that particular grain, but they also affect the way the particles behave within the simulation, for example, being more or less affected by the attractor. We can enable the emitter to create and destroy particles automatically. The controls here are similar to the emitter controls we've already seen on Emit. We can increase the life and rate so that new particles will last longer and be recreated less frequently. We can also increase the number of grains to allow more particles to exist simultaneously. You might have noticed that both blue and yellow particles are created. These colors represent the particle's charge. We can alter the likelihood that either charge will be created using the charge control. Charge is used in conjunction with magnetism. This affects how much oppositely charged particles will attract or repel one another. We can also enable what is called a flow field. This creates a grid within the display that affects the direction in which particles will flow. We can click and drag within the grid to alter the direction of the flow. You'll notice how the effects of each element in the simulation interact to create quite a complex movement of particles. This sometimes requires careful ongoing management of the various elements. So far, particles have been generating automatically, but it's also possible to trigger the creation of new particles with MIDI. Setting the number of grains to 0 enables MIDI mode. Each new MIDI note received will create a new unique particle, and the overall pitch will be affected by the MIDI notes as well. Vector grain is excellent at transforming samples into lush, grainy soundscapes. The kinds of sounds possible with vector grain depends on the source sample you use, so be sure to experiment with different samples. Now that we know how the vector control works, let's look at the other two vector devices. Vector FM is a simple FM and subtractive synth, similar to Ableton's operator, with the added benefit of the particle control system. Just like vector grain, it can generate particles automatically or via MIDI. Explaining how an FM synthesizer works is beyond the scope of this video, but if you know the basics of how synthesizers work, then Vector FM should make a lot of sense. In the first tab, we can set how many FM operators we have and their configurations. The second tab gives us controls for the carrier and modulators, as well as the 5 vector controls we're now familiar with. The last two tabs are exactly the same as vector grain, with controls for the particle simulation and the creation and destruction of new particles. Vector FM is capable of a wide range of sounds, from simple synths with a bit of added motion to complex FM noise machines. Finally, we have vector delay. Just like vector grain and vector FM, the last two tabs contain the controls for generating and controlling particles. The first tab contains most of the standard parameters you'd expect from a delay, like time, feedback, and a multi-mode filter. Vector delay has a few novel parameters as well. For example, pitch lets you pitch shift the delayed signal. And enabling recycle will feed back the repitching into itself, causing a cascade of rising pitches with each repeat. Enabling reverse plays each repeat in reverse. At the bottom, we have the 5 vector controls we're now familiar with. We can map these to affect elements of the delay. Let's first set up a few more particles. Each particle in vector delay's particle simulation represents a totally separate delay line that responds to the position of that particle, so it's possible to create really complex layered delays. Let's set the number of voices to 4. Then let's set the horizontal position to affect the delay time. We could set the vertical position to control the filter cutoff. And we could even set multiple dimensions of the particle simulation to affect the same parameter. Let's also set the distance from the center to control the delay time. Let's set the velocity of the particles to control the pitch. Once you've mapped a parameter to control pitch, you can quantize this to one of the preset scale types. Let's go with octave. You can already start to see that there's a lot of variety to be had with vector delay. This has just been a quick overview, but here are a few more examples of what's possible. We'll wrap up there for now. There are many elements of each of the devices we've overlooked, but we've covered most of the important controls for making sounds with Inspired by Nature. The devices are really complex, so take a bit of time to explore them. They're also incredibly powerful, so it's well worth spending the time to master them to add a new dimension of sound design to your music making. Remember that the kinds of sounds you get often depend on the source material you use, so be sure to explore different kinds of samples and inputs. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments. And if you want to get more Ableton Live tutorials, sounds, and effects, head to elephant.io. This has been Tom from Elephant. Thanks for watching.